Have some of you read the Nick blog? Let's be honest. How many of you read it? All right, great. So, because it wouldn't be good if everybody read it, because then you're going to hear a lot of things we're going to talk about. But I do recommend that everyone does read it, and I think you will want to read it after we have this conversation. It's titled The 6 Key Drivers That Are Going to Shape the Future of Senior Living, and it's a 6-part series. 5 have been released so far, and they focus on a number of things: the COVID pandemic, the staffing crisis, the new customer, reframing health and healthcare, the importance of data and analytics, and moving from siloed to seamless, which is the one that's coming next. When is that one? Is that coming?
Either next week or the following week.
Okay. Well, we want to dive into those today, but you and I spoke a few weeks back, and you referenced a quote from Henry Kissinger that was published right at the start of the pandemic. Can you share what that quote is?
Yeah, he wrote an article actually on COVID in the Wall Street Journal in April of 2020. And the key line of it was that the task of leaders is to manage the crisis while building the future. And I thought that was a great quote. It's still completely relevant today. Kissinger was drawing the analogy to World War II and the final year, when it was clear the direction that the war was going. And it was critical for leaders to prepare for a post-World War II world. And the pluses and minuses of that were key to what happened after the conclusion of the war. And he drew that analogy, which was pretty prescient, particularly because this was April of 2020. Nobody knew how long this thing was going to go on. But that whole idea of, and I would argue today, most folks in senior living have actually weathered 2 pandemics. One is COVID. The other is the workforce challenge. Each of those have been all-consuming, where there's a sense of, I can't focus on anything else. I just have to focus on this, because otherwise the ship's going to go under. And yet the reality is you have to, at the same time, be building the future, because if not, you're going to get disrupted right out of business.
Yep. So you've in your blog series, you said that the COVID-19 pandemic punctuated the end of the 2nd generation of senior housing. Can you explain kind of what do you mean by that to the audience?
Yeah, I mean, it accelerated and accentuated, I think, many trends. But when I talk about the end of the 2nd generation, when I view the history of our field, I look at 1960 to 1990 as the first generation of product, driven by certain, one, the growth of board and care homes, primarily from faith-based organizations. 2, the explosive growth of entrance fee CCRCs, again, driven by nonprofit organizations. And then 3, the explosive growth of nursing homes, driven by the Great Society legislation of 1965. And between 65 and 82, 83, half of the nursing homes out there today were built during that period of time. And so that was the first generation. The second generation, 1990 to 2020, was the explosive growth of the private pay senior living industry, particularly on the for-profit side, independent living, assisted living, and a little later, memory care. It's not that Bill Colson and Paul and Terry Clausen weren't around in the 80s, they were. But what drove things in the 90s was singularly the boomer daughter. The boomer daughter was in the workforce in record numbers, and when she had an issue with mom, dad, or in-laws, she didn't want to give up the job that that defined who she was, and she'd spent a whole career to have. But she also couldn't live with the guilt of putting mom in an old-style institutional nursing home. And along came a Paul and Terry with this gorgeous chandelier and entrance area and a curved staircase you would never want the resident to use. But of course not. You were selling to the adult daughter. And you had the Queen Anne furniture, the carpeting, and the adult daughter came back and said, I won't have the same sense of guilt. I can keep my job, and there's a place for mom. And really assisted living, which was around in the 80s, took off in the 90s. And I think the boomer daughter is going to have the same impact on the next generation of senior living as they think about what they want for themselves, because that product represents to boomers their parents' notion of retirement and of aging, and they don't want that. And in fact, much of the wellness focus I believe, is to do whatever I can in terms of lifestyle so I won't end up being put into senior living.
Talking about the Kissinger quote, the pandemic brought a lot of fatigue to all of us, but obviously to leaders in senior housing especially. And this next generation, if we're talking about, third generation or senior living 3.0 or whatever we want to call it, there's going to be leadership change. And it's going to, I guess, require different characteristics of leaders. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, part of transitioning to the third generation is recognizing, I think, we're going to have new product, we're going to have new terminology, we're going to have new ways of financing, new ways of delivery, and we're going to have new leaders. The not-for-profit sector, 70% of the organizations say that they expect to have a CEO change within the next 3 to 5 years. And for-profits, whether because of lenders and investors running out of patience or others just raising their hand and saying, I got my team through COVID, now it's time for me to exit. I'm exhausted and I'm not ready for the next run.
Yeah.
And so with that, what are some of the things I think we're going to need in this new generation of leaders? I would say they're going to have to be multilingual with a multi-perspective ability to have multiple different lenses through which they see what's going on in the outside world, in our industry, and in their company or in their buildings or in their products. Let me be a little more specific. I think the first key thing is going to be personal depth. And by personal depth, I mean somebody that's humble and secure, that's not know-it-all or do-it-all, but learn-it-all, and is able to empower and collaborate with their employees to maintain agility, which is going to be key. Secondly, I think in terms, it's operational savvy, which doesn't, again, mean being the expert in each area of operations, but it means being secure enough to hire folks who are smarter than you in each of the functional areas, and then knowing how to marshal them to be and really turn them loose in terms of innovation. Thirdly, I think is industry awareness. You're going to have to be aware of the trends to consolidation and what that means for you. What's happening in terms of technology or the integration of housing and healthcare, and how do you avoid, on the one hand, not being caught flat-footed with what's happening with the integration of health and healthcare into senior living, but on the other hand, not getting ahead of the tips of your skis and being into a value-based equation when value-based care in your market is not there yet, and suddenly you're left hanging. And so that industry awareness, the fourth thing, and there are 5 in all, the fourth thing I would say is to have government smarts. The era of private pay senior living, saying we don't have to worry about government, maybe a little bit in the state legislature because we're regulated at the state level, that era is over. The era of being at Capitol Hill starting in April 2020, saying we're not only a vital part of the healthcare system, we're the front line of defense in this national pandemic, that's changed the game forever. And so you're going to have to be savvy and understanding. You're going to have government smarts at both the state and the federal level, because housing and healthcare policy are going to be intertwined in ways you've never seen before. And it's going to be driven by the government, ultimately by governments concerned about their dollar expenditure. And then the last thing is what I'd call mega trend awareness or acumen. You're going to have to be aware of broader trends that are going on in our society. Take one, consumerism. That consumerism is going to drive an expectation of transparency if you're going to have trust. And you're going to be really surprised, I think. We're going to be surprised in things in areas before where the consumer just accepted, they're not going to accept. So transparency, yes, it means transparency about vaccine rates and case rates, but it also means how much longer are we going to keep secret our rates, believing we want the customer in the door so we can really explain to them why we charge as much as we do. That ain't going to last very long, folks, in my view. Other areas, depends on the part of the country. But there are going to be questions, how will you handle mom's engagement? And how will you handle her health care when the flu season strikes or the next pandemic comes along? Or, what are your staffing ratios at night and on the weekends? I read this or that in the New York Times. I want to know. Or a question that I've been recently with a lot of different operators in New England, and they're getting questions wanting to know, in essence, how much do you pay your staff? Because they're using the care for your staff as a proxy for what they think will be your care for their mom. So these areas of transparency, they're going to be, consumerism's going to drive it in the future. And you're either going to get hit by the side of the head of it, or you're going to be ahead of it.
So last fall, of course, was the first SLIF. We came back from the pandemic, and a lot of the conversations were about, regaining consumer trust and everything. But even dialing it back to SLIF in 2015, we first launched, these were things that we were still talking about then, right? Like, price transparency. What do you think is holding the industry back from actually doing some of these things? And I say this, and I don't mean this wrong, we produce content in a lot of industries, and senior living, as an observation, seems that they talk a lot about doing things, but not actually execute. And I think if Charles Turner's in the room, I know Charles would agree because he's made that comment in the past. What do you think holds back some of this?
We have at times suffered from an inferiority complex, for one, in my view. Two, right now, I can't stress, from the front line to the C-suite, we are, to a great extent, in an exhausted industry. By that, I mean we're physically, emotionally, and mentally, and oftentimes, usually, financially worn out. One operator said to me, I feel like my whole team is suffering from PTSD. And in that kind of situation, and then having on top of that, also the staffing crisis, and then the fact that we're not in healthcare or in hospitals where you're having parades and people cheer you and clap for you. Instead, what you're having is front page stories in the news that paint you as the villain, that the reason so many people have died is because of you, even though you've been putting your own health at risk to care for your residents and to keep them safe. So all of that has led to, there's a degree of, it's why, in a classic sense of disruptive innovation, there is no sector more primed for being disrupted right now than ours. Because you've got the move to home, you've got Amazon, you've got Best Buy, you've got Google, you've got Walgreens, you've got Walmart, you've got CVS. They have money, they have brand recognition, and they believe they have a superior way of delivering products to the consumer in the home. And that's a prescription for them, they feel, for success. Now, they tried to build it internally, and they've had spectacular failures. So now they're out acquiring. And, I track all the acquisitions of all these folks to try and put together the mosaic of what they hope to pull off. But put simply again, I think right now we're exhausted and we're also cash starved. And everything's focused on, well, not everything, but much too much is focused on short-term occupancy and short-term NOI growth. And that can mitigate against the kind of investments. Right now is the time to invest, to have the loyalty that Bill was talking about from their customers just now. How are we going to gain that loyalty with boomers? They don't want the experience their parents had. How are we going to provide them, again, channeling some of the things Bill said and Steve, your observation, how are we going to provide them the experience they're looking for that makes life worth living? For some, it's fun. For some, it'll be service and giving back. There'll be all kinds of different things, but ultimately, we've got to give them what the Japanese call their ikigai, their reason to get up for breakfast. And that is not, as a sector, I think we are really good at asking the questions that aren't the most important questions. And we haven't learned to ask of our customers the most important questions. What do I mean? We're really good at, your need for assistance with activities of daily living, instrumental activities of daily living, over-the-counter and prescription drugs, and oh yes, especially your ability to pay and for how long. But I don't know anyone that wants their sense of identity and purpose defined by any of those things. And we're not good at asking the most important question, which is, what matters to you? And that's not a healthcare question.
Yeah.
That's what matters to you. And the average resident moving into assisted living is going to be there for 3 years or less. And this is the last 3 years of their life. And the most important question is, what matters the most to you? Because your healthcare and everything we do in this building should be geared around your answer to that question. And our ability to provide that experience that makes, it was a rough time in Mom's last 3 years, but the experiences she had then and the joy that she was able to experience, I will never forget, and I will always be grateful to you.
Yeah. So I want to go on to the staffing crisis, because I guess we hit on a bit of like the new customer, and I think, we understand that. But staffing, when we're talking about the Kissinger thing, the crisis right now is staffing. On the panel earlier today, Chris, talked about we have to invest in our employees just as much as we're investing in the residents. What are your thoughts just on that? I know in your series you talk about this.
Yeah. Well, there's been a lot said and a lot of good stuff in this conference on staffing. I think fundamentally, we have to move from what I would call a transactional relationship with our hourly employees to what is one really based on a real human relationship. What do I mean? We, to a certain extent, with our shifts, had a sense that we need a widget that fills an 8-hour shift or a 12-hour shift, and that widget's got to do the following A, B, C, and D tasks. And what that means is we care about that person only from the time they clock in to the time they clock out, and to the extent that those things get done that we need done in that 8-hour shift. That's a transactional relationship. That doesn't make people feel valued. But it also misses the point of that many of our hourly employees are either in poverty or struggling to stay out of poverty. And so how do we can't be expected to solve those issues, but if we come alongside them in the struggles they have in their daily lives, the issues they bring with them to work, and rather than saying, leave all that at the door, that's not our interest, that's not our concern. That is the wrong approach in my point of view. I'll give you one quick example. Goodwin Living in Northern Virginia. They have a wait list of people that want to come work for them. Why? Because they responded to a resident interviewing a long-time dining service employee who was normally always cheerful, who was down, and why was, because he didn't think he was ever going to get his citizenship because the price was unaffordable and he couldn't get the time to do the studying. Well, Goodwin House then ended up, the employees raised $1 million. 99 employees have either passed or gone through and gotten their citizenship working for Goodwin Living. And the residents did the tutoring of all of those staff to be able to pass those exams, which, by the way, most of us couldn't pass today. And then the Washington Post wrote a front page story. And all of a sudden, they were besieged with applications. Wow. Why? Because of a company that showed they did several things. It gave the residents a sense of purpose. It gave the employees a sense of connection to the residents. And it gave the community a reputation that they really care for their front line. You do that, folks, you will have people wanting to come to work for you. Treat them as a transaction, you will have 100% turnover rates.
So that brings up the next thing on immigration. What are you thinking? I mean, especially politics aside, what do you think could be done to advance immigration at the company level?
Well, at the company level, you have to, I was recently with a provider, and they've been now for 15 years, they've had a presence in the Philippines. They have a recruiting and training program in the Philippines. Their comment to me was, 15 years ago, there were no providers from any other country other than the U.S. And we had a great thing going. Now, you know, we compete with Germany, we compete with a number of different other countries, but bottom line is you've got to be aggressive at the state level and you've got to have a clear path and program for people who are going to bring in. But let me address it to the bigger picture. Our workforce issues are not going to get solved by immigration, in my view, in the next 10 to 20 years. Just, you know, even all your major industry groups have now basically put their focus on nibbling around the edges to get little changes here and there that they can make a strong case for, because large-scale immigration reform, with the partisan deadlock that we have now, and no matter who wins tonight, I don't see it happening. So a sense that the immigration floodgates for workers that we need are going to get opened, I think, is naive. And to my mind, we have to start younger, but we have to sell, as Tom Grape and others said earlier today, this sense of purpose. But more than anything, if I look at the next 20 years, it won't be birth rate. We have coming up, starting in 2025, what demographers call the first ever sans-demic. That means without people. We will have fewer high school graduates each year. We will have fewer college graduates. So that's not a growing pool. Yes, we want to win a bigger share of it. The largest untapped workforce, and I have an article with a couple of others coming out in Harvard Business Review on this. The largest untapped workforce in America for the next 20 years will be people 50 to 75. And you go to V, which is the only company in our sector actively been doing this. A whole section of their website's on Encore Careers. I've been interviewing employees there in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. I interviewed a guy who was now 83. He came there at 66 after taking retirement from another career. And he says, this job keeps me alive and keeps me going. And he loves it. And the residents love him. But we have an opportunity with a workforce that, you know, Mark Freeman likes to say, retirement for boomers will be one part purpose, one part passion, one part paycheck. We can offer all three. We can offer something that gives you a sense of purpose. You're making a difference in a person's life. And it may be a dramatic difference when they only have a year yet left to live. You can also pursue a passion of wanting to be and engage with people, and you can get a paycheck. We're going to have to forget, as Jane said, I think, earlier this morning, you know, if we keep thinking about 8-hour shifts and 12-hour shifts, we're going to lose so big to other sectors. We've got to be thinking about flexibility, 4-hour shifts, 6-hour shifts. We've got to be thinking, too, with this older population about whether or not we provide every other year with a certain amount of notice. You can take 2 months. You'll get paid if you have any leave time, but beyond that, we will keep your job. Any benefits you have, you will keep, and otherwise it'll be unpaid. But you get to do that every other year because they want to be able to take that trip with the grandkids. But all this is an illustration to flexibility. But it's not going to come from the birth rate and a younger population. It's not going to come from new waves of immigration. So you got two options. And this is the picture Japan stared at 20 years ago. You've got two options. One, technology that makes your current workforce and future workforce more efficient. Yep. And secondly, you've got 50 to 75-year-olds, largest untapped workforce out there. And most of them now, even more than ever, need to work, and many want to work.
I'm curious, show of hands, is anybody in the audience actively targeting that demographic? So Tom back there. Yeah. Got the lights on.
And by the way, word travels fast in the 50 to 75-year-old community when you see that they have value. Remember, this is counter to the whole public narrative, which says whether it's the greeting card from Hallmark for turning 40 with black crepe and black balloons, or whether it's the retirement party, it's a counter narrative to the fact that your life is defined by deficits, loss, and decline. But rather it says, we value you. you have something to offer that we need. That's a counter narrative to the narrative that older adults hear every single day around the country.
So I want to move on to the other section, which is reframing health and healthcare. And not going to go too far into it, but there's one thing that in that series that got me. And you said that what determines health, and that to share that medical care is only 10% of the equation, what determines health. 60% is now understood to be shaped by personal behavior and the social determinants of health. I found that pretty fascinating. So how will this new understanding of health, how do you see this playing out with senior living providers in the next decade?
Well, first of all, 30% genetic, 10%
Yes.
medical care, 60% environmental behavioral factors. First of all, it's our opportunity, folks. Suddenly we're seeing that what determines health are the very things we're engaged with every day. Diet, exercise, engagement, having a sense of purpose. Some of you have heard me repeat the idea that, our activity directors, do away with activity directors. They're really, they're purpose matchmakers. They're about connecting people with something that gives them a sense of purpose. So they're not about filling your time with games when you're on this inevitable decline into absolute disappearance, which is death, but rather they're about connecting you with what gives you a sense of joy and purpose. So my point is that the discovery of the impact of social determinants of health on wellness and overall health is an incredible opportunity, because and in the old notion of health and of it being medical care and it being reactive and curative, all we did was be a constant source of high cost, high risk individuals on which the health system made a ton of money, particularly hospitals. With this new understanding, we become key because we have a concentration in our communities of, you have two groups amongst, well, a couple of just facts real quickly. Between now and 2050, 80% of the total increase in healthcare spending is expected to be due to increased Medicare spending. So you want to know why the government is so concerned to get on top of this, and why Medicare Advantage, even though it can have front page exposés where there were some accurate things said about it being Medicare disadvantaged in the New York Times, it's why the government's all in on this. But within that, lost my train, so let me just wrap it up then. But we have an enormous opportunity now because we play a key role in keeping people out of that acute care hospital. We've gone from a moat around our buildings in terms of healthcare to a moat around the hospital. With a moat around the hospital, we become key players because the highest spenders are the top 5% of Medicare users, account for 50% of all Medicare costs. The next 15% account for another 20%. So that's 70% of Medicare, driven by 20% of the population. Those are overwhelmingly our residents in our buildings. So there's enormous interest in those folks. And if I'm holding that healthcare dollar risk, you offer the opportunity, we offer the opportunity for scale, because it's all about scale. And then it's about having your eyes on those individuals 24/7. So we have a huge opportunity. If we don't take advantage of it, believe me, others will.
So one thing, we don't have much time. The other thing you talk about is the importance of data and analytics. We're not going to go into that. I, of course, encourage everybody to read the blog post. But the next one that's coming out was moving from siloed to seamless. And you and I were talking earlier about the whole concept of the continuum of care. And, can you share what you share with me?
Yeah, and again, since I know we're running out of time, I'll probably put this briefly. Healthcare has a concept of the continuum. And in senior living, we have a concept of continuum. There's a conference being held in December, and it's marketing to people in all the different silos of different senior care settings, and it's called the continuum. But I want to make the point that the continuum from the point of view of healthcare providers and the continuum from the point of view of senior living is a total myth and lie from the experience of the consumer. There's no continuum whatsoever. So there's a continuum that the experts see of different settings. And they see, well, gee, we've got it nicely segmented off. You go from this silo to this silo to this silo. But for the consumer, and for the consumer that pays for private pay senior living, they wish there was a continuum. What there is being bounced from one silo to another, where you, as the one needing care, your caregivers, your family members, and your data get lost every single time. And does the senior living provider come to your rescue? Usually not today. Usually it's your adult daughter or some family member that's got to make sure your data transfers and this and that. That's a huge opportunity, folks. But folks, they're not going to pay $8,000 or $10,000 a month or $4,000 a month if you're not really helping them with that. So continuum, yeah, there's a continuum in the eyes of professionals so they can tell Congress we have a continuum. From the point of view of the experience of the consumer, it's the exact opposite. And those that start to really offer a continuum from the point of view of the experience of the consumer are going to win. And they're going to win big because the consumer experience is the exact opposite of that today. And there's 3 steps to that. The first is communication, then coordination, and finally integration. Data's key to that. Also, someone in the role of whether you call it a lifestyle concierge, whether you call it a life navigator, whatever, and someone, though, who really gets to know that individual and what matters to them. And you've got to have a data platform that provides actionable data in real time. And so I think, again, we have a real opportunity here. The public now perceives that the continuum is a myth. It's a joke, and it's a cruel joke that the healthcare profession has kind of has played upon them.
Yeah. So a few very quick rapid fire questions here.
Oh, this will be fun.
All right. Since you were instrumental in creating the asset class, is it senior housing or seniors housing?
I've given in to the reality that it's going to be senior housing because if you want to have mainstream interest, it's going to be senior without an S.
All right, that's official. NIC or NIC?
Either one.
No, we have to agree on one.
More people, I mean, really, people use both. In the future, this is Bob Kramer now, I'm not speaking for NIC.
Yeah.
But in the future, I believe NIC will become like AARP, meaning you'll no longer know and you won't be reminded what the words stand for.
Yep.
It'll be known by the acronym. And so, too, when AARP did its multi-million-dollar branding study, they concluded there was such value in the acronym, they didn't want to get rid of it. But they fined staff members whenever those staff members would say publicly what the acronym stood for. And because the National Investment Center for Seniors Housing and Care, and the only people using the phrase seniors housing in 2033 will be investors and lenders especially, because they're the last ones to change. And we finally got them used to senior housing, and they won't change for probably 2 decades. But you will not be an operator. You will not be providing services to older adults. If you call it senior living, you're saying, I have what your parents wanted and what you don't want for yourself. Would you like to buy? I have senior living here.
Active adult, poor name, what would you call it?
There's a good debate going on right now on that. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, ultimately we're talking about its lifestyle experiences that we're offering. Mm-hmm. Whether or not that becomes, that is not, and that may be a good thing. That's not specific to an age. Mm-hmm. Active adult is terrible because it's an ageist term. When you're no longer able to live an active adult, what are you, an inactive adult? It's not an attractive picture. And again, let me maybe say just
30 seconds.
I don't lack for passion, and you all know that. But we have an enormous opportunity in our field right now. But we'll only seize that opportunity if we're the leaders in basically reframing expectations of what aging is like, and therefore what the experience will be of aging. And we have actually been complicit in promoting a sense of reinforced helplessness, and we've got to change that. If we're champions of a new way of thinking about the aging experience, which is real, and therefore changing that experience, will be ahead, will be an aspirational setting rather than what I would call an avoidance setting. Yeah. It's a key opportunity for us.
Thank you so much, Bob. Always a pleasure to have you with us.